Tracking is the sorting and grouping of students by perceived academic ability. Proponents of tracking say that ability-driven tracks make it easier for teachers to target instruction appropriately for varying student needs. Heterogeneous groupings is unfair because high achievers become bored from slower-paced instruction and a lack of challenging assignments, while low achievers cannot get extra help and are given goals they cannot achieve.
I think that there's kind of a well-meaning belief that instruction should be as targeted to each individual child's needs as possible, and I think many people then take the next step to imagining that the only way to do that is to have children physically separated from each other, either within class or into separate classes.
Some problems with tracking is that it provides an inadequate and inequitable education to students in low-level courses. It does this by providing a weaker learning environment. Lower track classrooms are usually assigned the least experienced teachers, even though they may be assigned students with the greatest needs, who may be the most challenging to teach. Another thing is that teachers tend to have lower expectations for students in the lower tracks. Next, tracking usually widens the gap in achievement between students in the top and bottom levels over time.
The second major issue with tracking in schools is that it promotes a separation of students in integrated schools along class and racial lines. Tracking and segregation have had a long history in the United States. Early in the 1900s, there was an influx of poor rural families and increasing immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe into the United States of America. Because of this, public schools began tracking based on IQ tests. These IQ tests were biased and wound up separating students among ethnic and class lines and put the poorer students in lower tracks versus the more wealthy students in higher tracks. Eventually, we see a decrease in the importance of this until in 1954, the passing of Brown versus Board of Education. Tracking and segregation appears in our education system once more and allows a de facto segregation in schools that had been forcefully integrated under the idea that separate but equal was no longer equal. Today, we see this problem persisting in many of our classrooms across the nation. In racially mixed schools, tracking usually produces resegregation of black and white students into different classes within the school, with fewer chances for minority students to progress to high school completion and college enrollment. There are preconceived notions about race, class, and intelligence, as well as lack of parental involvement and guidance counselor negligence that often leads to the misplacement of many students within tracks. In 1995, 93% of white students and 97% of Asian students who scored above 90 in national curve equivalencies were placed in gifted programs, whereas only 56% of Latinos who scored above 90 were placed in these high grouping programs. In this way, tracking tends to reproduce inequality. This reproduction produces a self-fulfilling prophecy that tells us that if students are labeled as educationally inferior or superior, that is how they will perform. Thus, tracking sends messages to students about inferiority and superiority that affects them for the rest of their lives.
Tracking has also been critiqued for perpetuating unequal access to a college-bound curriculum. Students believe tracking meant struggling students received less rigorous and engaging teachers and curriculum. One student said, "My teacher said, well, I'll be here to go to my AP class, but you guys are going to have a substitute. I see it like, so we're not good enough that you can come to our class too? That's not really fair." In lower tracks, fewer curriculum units are covered, the pace of instruction is slower, and the curriculum is more focused on rote memorization instead of critical thinking and higher order skills. Tests and homework are also taken less seriously in lower tracks oftentimes.
You look empirically at the characteristics of children in classrooms. Children are extraordinarily diverse in all sorts of ways, and if you group them on one characteristic, you're going to have a huge amount of diversity and variation on other characteristics. So first of all, we fool ourselves into thinking that we've got homogeneous groups of students. So then when we target instruction, rather than thinking about always differentiating instruction to just recognize and acknowledge students' differences as being normal, whenever we do that targeting, we are then limiting the possibilities for learning for all of the children.
Detracking is the dismantling of ability-driven tracks and the placement of students into classes that are intentionally heterogeneous in terms of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, perceived ability, and previous achievement.
Students within a detracked school cannot be segregated by race or class. Some ways to improve equity in untracked classrooms is by having teachers provide extra help to any students that have serious difficulties. Another way is to equip teachers with useful teaching methods, such as cooperative learning techniques that actively involve all students from a heterogeneous class in learning activities that are effective ways to improve achievement. Students should be rewarded for individual effort and progress, regardless of their starting points. Numerous studies have shown the positive effects of detracking in schools.
So let's look at a couple of those studies. The first one was conducted in the US by Carol Loris, Jay Hubert and Hank Levin. So in that study they followed students over 3 years when they were in tracks in middle school, and then the school's untracked, and they continued to follow students for the next 3 years. And when they were doing that, all of the students were taking the highest level work in those untracked classes. And what they found was the untracked students achieved more. They took more advanced courses, and they passed the state exams a year earlier than the students who worked in tracks. And those advantages were across the achievement range.
In one New York high school, after detracking, the Regents' diploma rate rose from 58% to 96%. After detracking, the percentage of Black and Latino students who were IB diploma candidates nearly tripled. The gap between minority and white students' graduation rates decreased from 56% to 4%.
After examining all the issues tracking creates, it is important to make detracking successful. Some ways we can do this is by hiring and retaining only those teachers who believe that all students deserve access to your school's best curriculum. It is also essential that principals do all they can within their schools to level the playing field and ensure that all students have equitable learning opportunities. Detracking is a lot of work, and it requires long-term commitment to the school